Hello, a very warm welcome to the webinar from the Science-Based Targets Initiative's finance team. My name is Hasina Sawa. I'm a financial institutions target analyst at the SBTi. Thank you for attending today. We hope to bring you a high-level but informative session. This webinar is mainly a public consultation Q&A session focused on the 3 draft financial sector resources. So before we begin, just some general housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be available on the SBTi YouTube channel. And the recording will also be available on our website. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box that can be accessed on the bottom of your screen. We are also joined today behind the scenes by colleagues from across the SBTi who will also be answering as many questions as possible in writing. If we don't get the opportunity to cover all the questions, we will respond to as many as possible on our social media channels and our website. So for today's topic, today's agenda, this webinar will run for around 60 minutes, and we will cover an introduction to our finance team, an overview of the documents and the consultation process, and then a chance for your questions to be answered by our speakers. For those of you who have just joined, you can submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will work to answer as many questions as possible during the presentation, in the Q&A, or in writing. So for today's speakers in the webinar, we have myself. I'm a financial institutions target analyst. We also have Tim Young, who is of Net Zero finance manager. And then we're also joined by Owen White and Howard Shee, who are both senior technical managers on the finance team.
Thanks, Hasina. As you all probably know, the SBTi released 3 consultation drafts last month, along with a feedback survey that is open for 60 days until August 14. The first document is a version 2 update of the existing near-term FI target guidance that was first published in 2020. The second document provides the conceptual framework and some initial criteria to be incorporated into a financial institutions net zero standard, or FINS as we call it, that will enable FIs to develop near and long-term net zero targets. The third document is the fossil fuel finance position paper, which outlines criteria to address FIs' activities in the fossil fuel sector. And just to emphasize, these 3 are consultation drafts, so they are not final, and that is why we are seeking your feedback and then taking any questions as well to support that. In terms of how these 3 documents relate to each other, first, the near-term guidance already exists, and it is the basis for current target validations. That is being updated in this version 2 to increase ambition and to provide clarifications. Second, the fossil fuel finance criteria will be incorporated in both the near-term guidance version 2 and the FIN standard. But there's going to be a difference there. So under the near-term guidance, it will only be applicable to FIs that choose to set targets based on this criteria, in order to cover their fossil fuel related investments and lending activities. And on the other hand, these fossil fuel finance criteria will be proposed as general criteria for all FIs under the FIN standard. And third, the FINS document, this is an initial conceptual draft. So we expect that there will be additional drafts before we have an implementation version. So in the long run, we do expect the FIN standard to absorb the near-term guidance. But until then, there are probably still a few steps left. So we expect the near-term guidance to remain valid and continue to be used for developing science-based targets and validating them for the foreseeable future. Just to give a quick overview of the 3 documents and what the consultation questions are about before we open it up for questions. The draft near-term guidance version 2, we have 5 criteria changes that help increase target ambition. So for example, there's a shortening in the time frame of scope 1 and 2 targets, and there's an increase in minimum ambition for scope 1 and 2 targets, SDA scope 3 category 15 targets, and also temperature rating targets. We also have other clarifications and revisions to improve interpretation and application, address FI challenges, and aid target setting. So a brief overview was provided during the public consultation launch webinar, as well as the near-term guidance consultation deep dive video. So for example, we have a target language template to help ensure consistency and comparability of targets. So this includes a low emissions intensity maintenance target for electricity generation project finance and real estate assets under strict conditions. So this was added to help accommodate FIs that have already achieved a low portfolio emissions intensity. Another note is table 5.2, which provides minimum coverage requirements. This has been revised with more granular specifications for each asset class to help address the many questions that we have received on this already. And then just a quick note on some other clarifications. So, being able to set targets on loan outstanding or commitment amounts, which was raised by some FIs. And then also that coverage requirements for investments via funds are based on the underlying holdings asset class. Now, a full summary of these updates can be found in Appendix G of the draft near-term guidance version 2. For the second document, the SBTi builds on the corporate net zero standard and the FI net zero foundations paper that was published last year to provide an updated conceptual framework. So those familiar with the SBTi corporate net zero standard will see some similarities in this graphic, where we look at the overall emissions trends over time. Here, however, we've also added a crucial additional pathway, which is on portfolio alignment. And this reflects the crucial role of FIs in increasing the share of their financial flows that are going to entities or activities that are transitioning along 1.5C pathways. This reflects our theory of change to get the financial sector to engage and influence the real economy to transition. So first, FIs will need to set near-term targets to increase the share of financial flows going to activities that are 1.5C aligned. And then second, essentially all of an FI's financial flows will need to be net zero aligned by 2050 or sooner, which third means that its portfolio emissions should also be reduced to near zero levels by 2050. That fourth are then complemented by the neutralization of these residual financed emissions. So when we establish that kind of framework, we look at 5 different types of criteria that we think are necessary to make these targets robust and transparent. So the first is organizational and portfolio target boundary. This represents the scope of the different types of financial activities that should be considered and how they should be prioritized over time. We then have criteria on near-term and long-term targets that address the type of targets that should be set, the granularity, and the different ambition rates expected over the near-term and long-term timeframes. Fourth, we have explicit criteria on fossil fuel finance, which is the next document. And finally, we have criteria on monitoring, reporting, and recalculation, which looks at the quality of data that is expected when establishing targets and expectations around disclosure and reporting to ensure transparency and proper tracking over time. Again, an overview of the FINS documents was provided in the FINS consultation deep dive video, as well as during the public consultation launch webinar. And then finally, for the fossil fuel finance position paper, the SBTi has historically focused on the emission reductions needed at a company level. to align with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreements. And we've taken the position that the target setting entity has the best knowledge of the mitigation options that are available to it in terms of technology, strategy, financial situation, etc. However, it's become clear that for financial institutions, there is a need to have more specifications around fossil fuel investment, lending, and facilitation activities if they are going to set robust and credible targets, and if we are going to limit global warming. So this consultation draft lays out some proposed criteria to address the financing of coal, oil, and gas. So generally, FIs will need to, 1, disclose all of its activities in the fossil fuel sector, 2, seize all new financial flows to unabated fossil fuel activities. And this is supported by 1.5C climate scenarios. 3, engage fossil fuel companies to align to 1.C pathways. And 4, phase out fossil fuel activities that are not 1.5C aligned if the engagement is unsuccessful. Now you can see here that there are differentiations between coal and oil and gas, as well as by country income groups. And this is based on climate scenarios and just transition considerations. Here, an overview was also provided in the fossil fuel finance webinar, as well as during the public consultation launch webinar. So that was a very quick recap of the 3 documents. We've had the launch webinar and then 3 deep dive videos there. So I hope you have seen those already. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Hasina to open up for questions.
Thanks, Howard, for the summary. So we hope that you found the information we've provided useful. So we've received lots of interesting questions today, and some have been answered already. But now we'd like to spend the rest of the session answering some of the most common or insightful questions. So the first question is for Howard on the near-term guidance updates. Could you please provide some more details on the new real estate asset class and its coverage requirements in Table 5.2?
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned, Table 5.2 was revised with some more specifications. So one of them is that we kind of tried to detail out the requirements for real estate as a separate asset class. In terms of definitions, we are referring to commercial real estate asset loans as all loans that are related to real estate assets. So that's residential and service buildings that are not provided to consumers. So if they're provided to consumers, then that would fall under, obviously, consumer loans for residential mortgages. Now, on the other hand, general purpose loans to REITs or real estate companies, that can be considered just a corporate loan. So there's a differentiation there. So hopefully it's clearer what we mean by these different terms. And maybe just a quick note here that we've received some questions on. So generally in Table 5.2, if there's no differentiation between short and long-term loans, then both are required. So for real estate asset loans, both short and long-term loans in this category are in scope. And then I guess generally, again, investments via funds or collective investment schemes are the target should be based on the underlying holdings.
Thanks, Howard. We have another question on the update. So what do FIs need to do if and when a new methodology comes out, for example, sovereign debt? Do I need to resubmit a target covering the new asset class immediately?
Thanks. Yeah, I think we've received this question before, so hopefully it can be cleared up. So the SBTi hasn't applied criteria changes retroactively. So targets that are already validated will remain valid for up to 5 years. When FIs do update their targets within that 5-year period, they will need to meet the criteria that are in effect at the time of target submission. So eventually you will need to, but criteria changes won't be applied retroactively. But of course, FIs are welcome to update their targets earlier and cover new asset classes as methodologies come.
Thanks, Howard. So the next question is on the FIN standard, and this is for Tim. Why has the FIN's paper introduced a broader and more holistic approach to coverage?
Thank you, Hasina. Can you bring up, Rosie, please, slide? Let me just check. Slide 24, please. So this relates to some criticisms we've had from the existing near-term guidance, in the sense that if a asset class or activity is in scope, then a specific target has to be set for that asset class itself. And what this led to is, this was okay for entities like private equity, who have, generally speaking, just all equity investments. But for larger FIs with multi-asset and activity platforms, then you had, say, a target asset for the asset class of equities and also for corporate loans. So some FIs were saying, well, I've got a very small equity portfolio, so the overall portfolio emissions from that portfolio is virtually zero as a percentage of my overall balance sheet. Whereas corporate loans, they are, 90% of my balance sheet or 60%. Therefore, they have much higher climate relevance for us. So why do we have to set targets for both when really we should be focusing all our efforts on corporate loans? So when developing the FIN standard, or the FIN's guidance to date, we looked at that approach and decided that should we have a more holistic view whereby FIs can put all activities or certain activities within the portfolio target boundary. So that means, where there is a GHG accounting framework, where a methodology has been established for that asset class or activity, and SBTi is deemed to be in scope as it has influence on that asset class or activity, then should we allow a wider portfolio target boundary for target settings? So to the extent you have corporate loans and equity in one portfolio target boundary, provided you can meet your targets for emission reductions simply by focusing on the corporate loan portfolio, you don't have to focus on the equity portfolio. So it gives you greater flexibility to go where the climate relevance is greatest in your portfolio. So hopefully that answers that one.
Thanks, Tim. And then also, if you could please answer regarding the FI net zero consultation draft. The SBTi is using an alignment approach for the near-term criteria instead of an emissions target-based approach. Can you explain why this was felt appropriate?
Yes, certainly. And this is one of our favorite diagrams, what we call the gray line and the green line. And the idea is on portfolio alignment, you're going up the green line as more and more of the portfolio aligns. And in turn, that will reduce portfolio emissions, so you go down the gray line. And this is really what we're talking about here, in the sense that for the FINs, the goal is to make financial flows consistent with 1.5 degree centigrade pathways. So the way to do that is through the lead indicator, i.e. portfolio alignment. So you get more and more of your portfolio over time aligned with 1.5 degree pathways. And that's the approach we're taking here in terms of aligning the portfolio as a leading indicator and focusing on portfolio emissions rather than portfolio divestment or other things in order to reduce portfolio emissions. Then, as a lagging indicator, portfolio emissions should start to fall. So as you go up the green line, then you go down the gray line. As portfolio alignment increases, portfolio emissions should fall. So we focus in the near term on portfolio alignment, but we do still require reporting of portfolio emissions. that's required under criteria FINS C17. But the overall attention in the near term is focusing on the leading indicator, which is portfolio alignment.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, continuing with FINS, I have a question for Owen. So will SBTi require both alignment and emissions targets in the near term and long term?
Yeah, thanks, Asina. It very much builds on Tim's answer there, that when we look, for example, at the long term, we see both alignment targets and emissions targets being essential, and they kind of play sort of two related roles. First of all, on the alignment side, we want in the long term to reach a very, very high share of financial flows to be fully net zero aligned. So you're financing entities and activities in the real economy who have reached that net zero performance level. Likewise, then that long-term emissions target is necessary to actually make that net zero claim, as in your portfolio results in net zero emissions. How we look at that though in the near term is slightly different, and it's one of the key points of this consultation around the need to have both forward-looking alignment targets and emissions targets in the near term, because what we found is that often they can lead to different types of incentives. So we're in our current framework, we have both alignment type targets, for example, portfolio coverage, temperature rating, and many financial institutions just use those types of targets and they don't set emission reduction targets. Because ultimately emission reduction targets in the near term often focus on reducing exposure to emissions rather than actually financing maybe high emitting activities in order to align them. So there often is this conflict between financing the transition, which may increase your portfolio emissions in the short term, versus emission reduction targets, which often force you then to reduce exposure and can lead to divestment. So one of the questions you want to have is that while we want to prioritize near-term alignment targets, is there also a need to have emission reduction targets either at the sector level or the asset class level to complement these alignment targets? That is definitely a key question. We know, for example, that if we look at the types of entities who are setting targets right now, typically asset managers, asset owners will often set portfolio coverage or temperature rating type targets, whereas banks typically will set emission reduction targets using sector-based SDA approaches. So we both see these kind of as very relevant, and these will play an important role in the near term. It's really the question then of, are both necessary, or is alignment by itself sufficient? And that's kind of one of the key areas that we're looking to have feedback on in this consultation.
Thanks, Owen. And also relating to FINS, what is the long-term vision of using maturity scale? Will it allow green and transition finance targets to be incorporated into an FI's SBTs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the intentions of the FINS framework as well is to be able to provide, I would say, a more comprehensive approach to target setting for financial institutions. And we know, so since we launched the guidance 3 years ago for our near-term targets, there's been a lot of great work done on transition finance, green financing, and using other types of methods. So what we're trying to establish here with the FINS process is, a more holistic framework that will allow us to also integrate other methods in the future. The maturity scale was introduced primarily to show that as we move from near-term targets to long-term targets, we also need to capture the fact that companies in the real economy and that are in portfolios will also need to actually not only set targets, but ultimately meet those targets and reach a net zero level. So the maturity scale also allows us to be able to track the progress of companies in portfolios. An example being right now is that financial institutions are setting portfolio coverage type targets, which are focused on increasing the number of companies in their portfolios who have targets. Now that as an indicator is very relevant in the near term, but it becomes less relevant in the long term as we need companies not only to have targets, but ultimately companies to be decarbonizing, and then by 2050, for companies to actually reach those net zero levels. So that's what the maturity scale allows us to be able to do, is to look at both ambition, performance, and indeed then reaching the end state. The other key element of the maturity scale is also to be able to capture other types of activities which are traditionally not addressed in our current methods. So these kind of climate solutions or green finance typically focused on activities like renewable energy, carbon removal, other types of activities in the economy which are already fully net zero aligned. And these are traditionally not captured very well with our methods. So the maturity scale also allows us then to look beyond simply entity setting targets and portfolios, but also looks at what other types of activities in the real economy do we want to incentivize, to ensure then that we actually also have the ability to incorporate other types of methods, which can, for example, include things like carbon removal. And currently that's not really addressed in our framework, but it's clearly something that we need to incentivize finance now. So that maturity scale is built out in order for us to be able to look at those methods. And that is work that we're currently doing now in parallel, is developing that methods piece, and that will then be fully integrated into that maturity scale. And it will allow essentially a broader approach for financial institutions to assess their overall financing. So not only that they're financing companies in the real economy who have targets and are reducing emissions, but they also have a means then to count their financing of transition activities or financing, climate solutions like carbon removal. And as Tim mentioned, that should ultimately then bring you up the green line and increase your overall portfolio alignment.
Thanks, Owen. So I have a question for Tim. How is SBTi considering and evaluating a larger number of financial assets or activities to be captured in the portfolio target boundary?
Thank you, Sina. The answer to that is it's similar. It remains similar to the near-term guidance in the sense that within the portfolio target boundary are only in-scope assets. What does that mean? That means, first of all, there is a GHG accounting methodology available for it. Sorry, accounting framework available for it. Second is that the coverage principles apply, and that's split into two itself. The first being that there is a methodology, a suitable methodology. At the moment, there are 3/4, if you include fossil fuel methodology, available to FIs in target setting. We're working at the moment on the meta criteria and methods and looking to potentially increase that level, but at the moment there's only 3/4 methodologies. And the final thing then is if the influence principle applies, and therefore does the FI have influence over that asset, for instance, equity. So to be within the portfolio boundary, that means it's in scope. Once it's in scope, it's available for target setting. As said, whether there is actually a target set against that asset or activity or the wider portfolio target boundary is a question that we have that forms criteria FIN C10, which is available for as part of the survey for input on the answer to that question. Do we have a wide portfolio target boundary with targets set against the overall portfolio, or do we continue with a sort of more prescriptive approach and have a narrower portfolio target boundary whereby individual targets against a narrower group of asset classes and activities? That's one of the questions we've got, and refer to criteria C10 for that. But effectively, it remains that within the portfolio target boundary, the assets are in scope. That means there's an accounting framework, methodology, and influence. Back to you, Hasina.
Thanks, Tim. Owen, I have a question also relating to funds. Could you please clarify the link between portfolio coverage approach and portfolio alignment? Do you envisage that it will be possible for a private equity fund that uses a portfolio coverage approach for a near-term target to have the option of setting a similar type of target, even if it's not referred to as portfolio coverage approach, for the long-term net zero target?
Yeah, thanks, Hasina. No, it's a great question. And kind of what I referred to a little bit earlier as well is that we see portfolio coverage really the first step, because all it focuses on is engaging those companies to set targets. The portfolio alignment approach essentially extends that portfolio coverage to also look at, are the companies meeting those targets over time, and for that to also be captured as part of the target. And in the long term, it is not only that the companies have targets, but ultimately the companies actually reach net zero. So in our view, when we look to say 2050, for example, within a an equity portfolio or a private equity portfolio for that matter, the goal is not only that 100% of portfolio companies have SBTs, but by 2050 it will ultimately be that 100% of them have reached net zero. So they've set their SBT, they've decarbonized and ultimately neutralized their emissions. So what it essentially does is it extends the initial concept of portfolio carbon and indeed temperature rating. You just look at the ambition of companies, but as we go into the longer term, then we can an ambition through to performance and then ultimately through to reaching that end state of net zero. So the concept being that in fins we're effectively extending a lot of the methods that we have currently in our near-term framework to be able to take into account that journey of an individual company, and that represents the journey of the overall portfolio emissions.
Thanks, Owen. So this is a question on carbon removal projects. I'm not sure if you or Tim would like to answer, but is there guidance for financial institutions that invest in carbon removal projects, and how should they be accounted for?
Yeah, I can certainly make a start. Yeah, in terms of carbon removal projects, so we haven't dealt with this specifically in the consultation draft for us. It's more of a method question. But the concept of kind of carbon removal or negative emissions is really dealt with in two key areas as part of this conceptual framework. So the first ultimately being on the portfolio alignment side, where if you're financing negative emissions or carbon removal activities, clearly that's net zero aligned, given that fundamentally they are net negative. So every dollar, if you like, of lending or financing or investing in those projects or companies would be considered fully net zero aligned. So we do want to be able to actually capture those there. We are looking at then the types of methods in the taxonomies, for example, that will allow us to be able to incorporate those types of activities. But our intention is that they should be captured, because that is clearly an activity that we want to be able to incentivize, and that should be counted as part of an FI's overall financing strategy. The other approach then is where are those those carbon removals captured is, of course, in the neutralization piece around how do we reach net zero emissions in a portfolio, and that will require some balancing of positive residual emissions and indeed balance those with some kind of negative finance. So we have a section on neutralization in the consultation draft, which also brings in how carbon removal is captured there. And that is where financial institutions will use financing of carbon removals or negative emissions to also balance any remaining positive residual emissions.
Okay, thanks, Owen. So the next question is, let's see, what is the difference between 1.5C aligned holdings and net zero aligned holdings, and why do the two have seemingly similar concepts?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's another good question. So it relates a little bit to some of the previous questions as well around being able to reflect the different stages of companies in a portfolio. So a company who is, for example, 1.5 aligned now is typically reflects their ambition. So do they have a 1.5 aligned target? Over time, what will count there, and the SBTi is working on our MRV standard to do this, is what does it mean to have 1.5 aligned performance? So how can we tell that the company is actually meeting that target with the emissions time series? And the net zero aligned portion is brought in to say, well, at what point is a company fully aligned with net zero, which is when they've actually reached net zero emissions. So we've introduced those concepts to be able to better describe the different stages of companies in a portfolio. So you may, for example, have that portfolio now where you have some companies who just have 1.5 ambition, so they have a target. Other companies who, for example, could be demonstrating that they are actually decarbonizing along 1.5 levels. And you may indeed have other companies who have already finished that journey and they've already fully reached net zero. So, rather than simply grouping all those together and treating them the same, they should actually be reflected slightly different, because they show companies at very different stages in their overall transition. And while we want to be able to, incentivize financing of entities that are actually undertaking that transition, as we move from near to long-term targets, what's important is being able to have the indicators that can show companies who don't just have the ambition, but actually have reached that end state point. So that's why we say, 1.5 aligned is very much a transition indicator. Are they transitioning fast enough to be fully consistent with a 1.5 degree world? Whereas net zero aligned is, are they ultimately compatible at a performance level that is compatible with that net zero end state? And that is very much set out in our corporate net zero framework, which describes, the long-term ambition that the company has to meet, and indeed the different neutralization of it will have to be incorporated to be able to say that they are, fully net zero.
Thanks, Owen. So also relating to funds, how does the long-term portfolio alignment target relate to the long-term emissions target?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just coming back on screen for that one. Sorry, how does the long-term alignment target relate to the long-term emissions target?
A long-term portfolio alignment target, yeah.
Yeah, so it just comes back to the original question, which is that initially, in the short term, we're looking at portfolio alignment. Why are we doing that? Because we want financial flows from a financial institution to align to a 1.5 degree pathway or pathways as soon as possible. So that's the leading indicator, is portfolio alignment. In the long term, obviously, as more and more of the portfolio aligns to 1.5 degree pathways, then the longer term target is emission reduction. So again, as you go up the green line, then more and more the grey line should start falling, and the lagging indicator, i.e. the indicator for later on for longer term targets, is the emission reduction as it falls towards net zero, towards 2050. So that's why we have the alignment as the leading indicator, and then emissions reduction overall from the portfolio as the lagging indicator, as one should lead to the other. And again, why do we bother with that? Why do we do that? Well, it considers things like real world emissions just being transferred elsewhere through just simple divestment to reduce emissions. It's more encouraging and FIs to engage with their underlying clients and put them on pathways towards net zero, rather than simply divesting to alternative investors who may not take the same view, perhaps of the desire to reach a 1.5 pathway. So that's why we're looking at alignment within FINs. We're looking first of all at alignment, and then as a lagging indicator, portfolio emission reductions. Obviously, alignment doesn't mean anything if portfolio emissions aren't falling towards net zero by 2050. But if you are aligning, you should be doing, it should be a natural consequence of aligning, is that portfolio emissions are reducing over time. Back to you, Hasina.
And maybe I might, sorry, Hasina, I might just maybe add one point to that question. I think is what we asked in the consultation here. One of the key questions is around the level of ambition required for long-term alignment targets. So whether that should be 1995 or 100% of financial flows should be fully net zero aligned, and that does ultimately impact then the emissions approach, because say for example, if you only reach 90% net zero alignment, that means that 10% of the financing is going to companies, for example, who have not yet reached net zero, and therefore the FI will have to neutralize those residual emissions in order to actually meet the net zero emission target. So the more alignment you have, so as you go from 90% up towards 100%, essentially the less neutralization is required. And that mirrors our corporate framework as well, where the more companies actually reduce their emissions, the less neutralization they have to engage in. So we want to mirror that approach on the financial framework, and that's why we have those two types of targets in the long term, and not simply just an emissions goal of reaching net zero, but is to more kind of highlight what is the level of neutralization that we think is credible for a financial institution to have in order to be able to say that they, that their financing has actually contributed towards reaching that net zero goal. We have situations now, for example, where financial institutions they're saying they have a net zero portfolio because they're balancing their equity portfolio with financing renewable energy projects. It's not zero. And what we're trying to highlight is that those calculations are really only relevant once you've also gotten a significant portion of your portfolio holdings to actually reach that net zero level. So it's really critical for us then, as we ask that question on long-term alignment, what is that level we want to see? But that is directly related then to the amount of utilization that will be required as well, and be required to be undertaken by that FI to meet for the alignment and indeed then the emissions target.
Thanks, Owen. So this is going to be, I think, the last question. So it's kind of related to what the previous one. So in funds, what are the types of mechanisms that are under consideration for portfolio neutralization?
Yeah, thanks, Asina. So for in terms of the mechanisms for neutralization, this is really the types of carbon removals that essentially will count, and how the financing should be reflected. So we looked at a few different options for this process. So first of all, clearly separating the neutralization of operational and value chain emissions from the portfolio and the finance emissions. So as far as we're concerned, that for any financial institution, their operations, so scope 1 and 2, and their value chain scope 3, category 1 to 14, should be treated like any regular corporate. And the emissions will have to decline by at least 90% in absolute terms. And then neutralization can be undertaken, and that can be done via, for example, the purchasing of high quality removal credits. That's only for the operation of the value chain. For the financing side and the portfolio emissions, we've also looked at a number of approaches, but we always want to keep those separate because they are ultimately separate accounting systems. So for the finance emission side of things, the priority is really is to balance positive finance emissions with negative finance emissions. And the kind of final list of what would qualify as a value removal, we have not fully defined that yet. But it would be, for example, technological and nature-based solutions, would have that permanence built in, and the high quality nature of the validity of those removals, and ultimately their permanence. So that's kind of one of the core aspects that we're doing, and we're doing some wider work with the SBTi research team as well to ensure that we have much more detailed guidance on the removals for both corporates and indeed then for financial institutions. So that's kind of one area that we've looked at. The other element, of course, then is the role of carbon credits and how they may or may not be used for portfolio emissions neutralization. So on the one hand, a financial institution could come along and finance a carbon removal project, or they could indeed just purchase the output of that project, which may be an actual credit. So we have some questions in the draft and the scenarios around the implications of actually those two mechanisms. And who can and what kind of claims can be made based on whether you actually finance the project itself, and so hence it's a part of your portfolio, or you simply purchase the output of the credit. So that's kind of one of the core questions. But we will be then, as part of the overall standard, producing more of a list in terms of what would be those eligible types of projects, and should they be technological based, nature based, and the various quality criteria that would go with that as well. That would be a key element. And that will also then be reflected in our corporate standard as corporates as well, and indeed in our VPCM work, which we're publishing as well, which will both look at the different quality criteria for different types of removal projects.
So thank you, Owen, Tim, and Howard, for all your input. So thanks to everyone for your attendance and the brilliant questions today. If you have any specific questions relating to the 3 drafts, I would also recommend that you refer to our YouTube page and refer to our deep dive and our webinars on the 3 draft documents in case you have those specific questions. And I think a lot of answers may be found there for the deep dives on these particular drafts. So please don't forget to submit your feedback you can find it on the QR code here if you have any survey feedback. And also, if we haven't been able to answer your question today, we'll try our best to do so and follow up communication. So please sign up to our mailing list to keep informed. And a link to the survey will also be will also be found in the chat. So following the consultation, our team will review all the feedback submitted and update the resources. We expect to publish the updated near-term framework before the end of this year and the first operational fin standard in 2024. So please check our website, social media, and newsletters for regular updates. And thank you once again to everyone for participating in this webinar. Goodbye.